Hi everyone and welcome to another game review by ThinkerThemer. I'm Amy, this is my fiance Maggie.
Hello.
Together we review games from two different perspectives. I'm all about the mechanics, Maggie is all about the theme, and today we are reviewing a game that's just come in from Essen, and that is Boonlake by Alexander Pfister and published by DLP Games.
Yes, in Boonlake we are all arriving to the town of Boonlake, which is by the lake called Boonlake. But what you'll see here is actually we're going to be going down a river that I imagine is to the side of Boonlake. Anyways, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be traveling around this town where there's very few inhabitants, so we are actually going to be looking at developing different towns and settlements along the way. And we're going to be doing a combination of things to achieve that. Eventually, at the end of the day, is going to be whoever's got the most prosperous town combination of things. So whoever was the most entrepreneurially wise, or the bigger settler will be the winner in the form of victory points, of course.
Now, if you're familiar with any of Alexander Pfister's games, then this game will not look particularly foreign to you when you look at it, because there are a lot of his ideas that have been jam-packed into this game. The game has a really interesting action selection mechanism, and that is really what drives what you're going to get done in this game. It takes the form of this set of tiles that get passed around the table, and on your turn, you're going to be selecting a tile that lets you do a few different things. One, it tells you which action you're going to be able to do on the main board. Two, it dictates what type of card you can play from your hand into your tableau. And three, it gives you a number of moves that your ship can then travel down the central river that is the timer for the game. Now, the interesting thing about this action selection system is that the person before you is going to be removing one of these tiles to play out the actions that they've chosen. And when they're done with their turn, they're going to be placing it at the bottom of the pile and sliding everything else up. And what that means is the most appealing actions that everybody wants to take at the same time are constantly being removed from the top part of this action selection board and pushed down to the bottom. Why that's important is because the action tiles at the lower end of this board get fewer steps along the river, and if you select one of the last two, you actually have to pay a penalty in victory points, meaning that you need to sometimes look at an alternative action to the one that's most efficient for you. Now, the main actions that you can get done in this game center around this board, which is made up of these different zones or towns where we're all going to be competing to place our settlements. And so what you can do in terms of some of those actions that you'll be selecting from is you can grab a new land tile and place it adjacent to one that already exists, take the bonus that's going underneath it, and that's going to give you a way to extend out your settlement. But when it comes around to your turn, you're first going to need to place an inhabitant on that new tile, also gaining the bonus that's there. And then on a next turn, you might want to upgrade this inhabitant to a house, and then upgrade your house to a settlement, following the placement rules, which I'm violating right now, but just trying to give you an idea of how this upgrades throughout the game. As you remove pieces from your player board, you're going to be unlocking income in the form of money and victory points that exist underneath these buildings. And every time we go through an interim scoring, you're going to be able to get that income along with the income that you're generating from the two tracks. We have a coin track on this side of the board at the top, and we also have a card track, which is going to feed you new cards for your hand. So if you're familiar with some of Pfister's other games, such as Maracaibo, you also know that he does tend to love a multi-use card. And this game has plenty of those. It comes with quite a big stack of cards. And these cards all have different suits, which, as I mentioned earlier in the game, are based on what you can play is based on which action you're selecting at the time. And when you play these cards, they're going to be put down into a tableau in front of you, and they are going to give you ongoing benefits, but importantly, sometimes a one-off benefit, but importantly, they're also worth victory points at the end of the game and are another large source of victory points. In order to build these cars, you're going to need resources, and the resource management in this game is quite interesting. At the top of your player board, there is an area that has these little canoe type meeples, and that's going to dictate how many of any resource you have at any one time. You're first going to need to be able to collect the resource to build it out to show that you have it, but in order for it to be active, the little canoe has to be sitting directly underneath that resource at the time you want to spend it. And to the right of your player board is this very clever lever system. Along the way, you're going to be able to collect these little levers in the shape of a door and place them onto one of these benefits by paying the associated cost. Once you have it there and the time arises where you need a little bit of a helping hand, you can pull that lever down, which activates the bonus, and then the lever stays down until you're able to bring them all back up again during the interim scoring. Speaking of interim scoring, the timer of this game is this river where you'll be first traveling down and turning around and then going back up and traveling back down again all the way and out and through. And along the way, you will be able to leapfrog each other to get down the river quicker, to pick up these bonuses along the way. And every time we go through one of these blue gates, the first person to do so is going to trigger an interim scoring round. At the end of the game, the main way you're going to score points and ultimately win is to have as many of these levers built out as possible, to have a big tableau full of point-ridden cards, and then also to have built as many of these settlements as possible to score some points on your player board. There's more to it, but as this is not a teach, I'll leave it there and we'll talk about some more of the mechanics as we talk about our thoughts on the mechanics.
So this game is quite interesting because at first glance of the box, I was like, ooh, I really love that artwork. I really like the artwork on the box. But then when you open it up, it's like, this is different. This feels sort of different to this artwork. This just reminds me of Great Western Trail. Very familiar, very kind of, your dry Euro-y type style.
Yeah, we really like Great Western Trail as well, so there's a familiarity, which is
absolutely
comforting.
Yeah, and then, you have the cards, and the cards then felt like they had a different kind of artwork, which I actually really like. So it's like individually, I like them all, but they all feel like this game is going through a bit of a potentially an identity crisis from an arts or aesthetics point. Not a big issue in and of itself.
I know, because I love the flower, and the only place the flower is really the first person marker.
First player token. I was hoping that there would be some information about it in the rule book. There was very little sort of thematic
flavor
information,
text.
Flavor about it, which was a bit of a what do you call it? Like a foreboding, like a bit sort of letting you know that this is not going to be a heavily thematic game. Things that we did like, or I did like about it, that action selection mechanic is quite interesting. Aside from the fact that it can, sort of topple apart, like fall apart if you're passing it around, it can be a bit precarious. But the fact that you have the weigh up the choice of, am I going to go for one of the more powerful top or higher spots where I'm going to have more opportunity to then move my boat. But then, usually the things that are sitting towards the top are going to be the least popular options, or not necessarily the less powerful, but the ones that obviously, no one's been wanting, so they've been sort of moving all the way to the top. That can be an interesting...
Yeah, I think this is really clever. I think that the element of if you take a top action, you get more river movement flowing down the river. To me, the river was really underplayed, I thought. If there were more powerful actions that were happening on the river itself, then this part of the action selection game would be more interesting. Because throughout this game, no matter how many times we played it, at whichever player count, I really felt like I didn't care so much about the river. Because the interim scoring is... It happens when the first person goes over this little barrier here, or this barrier, or this barrier. And that's fine. And it's fine to have control over when that gets triggered. That's a little bit interesting, but you can kind of see it coming from a long way away. There's not a lot of leapfrog that's happening, especially in a lower player count game. And the bonuses that are printed on the river are not that powerful until you get to the very end. So if you're racing through, it really only pays off right at the end anyway to be ahead of everybody else.
Yeah.
It doesn't, you're not blocking each other very much.
No.
And, you know, it's the difference of getting 2 coins or 3 coins. It's not hugely impactful, which means that this was not that interesting to me aside from the last 2 spots. So the last 2 spots, you have to pay 2 or 3 victory points to use the tile that's placed there and therefore the action that's depicted on it. That was annoying because if everybody was wanting to build something at the same time, then it meant that it was always there and you were a little bit hamstrung in terms of what you could choose if you didn't want to take that penalty. And most of the time I didn't want to take that penalty. So it was just about kind of adjusting your strategy a little bit. As Maggie mentioned, this action selection board does not have a piece of cardboard at the bottom of it. And I was the biggest, I know this was culprit, but when I would pass this, sometimes I would forget about that fact. And all of a sudden, all of the actions would slide out.
All over the table. Yeah.
All over the table. And the biggest problem with that is that the order of them is really important. And because there's duplicates of the same color, it's not easy to remember what order they were in once you drop them, and that is really disruptive to the game. So I know that you need to slide them in, but if there was just a little strip of cardboard here underneath them, it would give a little bit more protection, because you do need to generally pass this around the table because you've got to look up close at your options that are available to you.
Yeah, there's combinations of things happening in each one of those tiles. The other thing that I did really enjoy about this is the fact that whenever anyone's taking one of those tiles and taking one of those actions, it's not just, that's the other thing that's interesting. There's not just one single action. Usually there's a combo of things that that person can do. And then there's going to be an auxiliary or an additional action that everyone else around the table also gets to do. So it gives you a bit of incentive to be paying attention, or you're kind of invested in everyone's turn because there's something that you're going to also be able to do. It's usually fairly straightforward and fairly quick. But yeah, I think it adds a nice element of just, well, I'm now just going to not worry about what's happening until my turn comes all the way around.
Yeah, I enjoyed that too, that no matter what people were doing, you got this bonus action. But I feel as though this particular part of the game is one of the most clever parts of the game, but also the part that makes this game drag on. One, because you can't really decide what you're going to do until the person before you has taken their action tile, so that you know what's going to be available to you, which leads to a little bit of AP when you finally get this and you're looking at it and now I'm reevaluating my choices. Then it has to be communicated what everybody else gets to do. Now we have to wait for everybody else to take this auxiliary action. Even though you can do it a little bit simultaneously, it still sometimes needs to be, you know, there's a lot of things to communicate when you're choosing an action. And it really slows the game down. Also, just passing this around or making sure that everybody can see it, it slows the game down. So I have things that I really like about this and things that I don't like so much. Other parts of the game that I really enjoyed, the resource management is actually really clever. So we touched on it when I was talking through an overview of how it works. But once you have these resources put into your player board, you can also upgrade them so that they're more valuable. Then this little puzzle of moving your canoes up and down to make sure that you have the right combination of resources that are depicted on your cards is really quite interesting, because your canoes can move one direction without causing you any cost. But if you want to move them backwards, you have to pay $2. And that leads to an integration of both managing these resources and thinking about the order in which you play the cards from your hand, because you don't want to be changing your resource allocation too many times. Otherwise, you're paying too many penalties. So I was always looking at, well, at the moment I've got lots of wood, so I'll try and get all the cards with wood out first before I mess with this.
Yeah, it's also quite tricky to get those resources. Like, they don't come by all that easily. And a lot of it, particularly in the earlier stages of the game, they're actually bonuses that you get for placing some of those territory tiles on top of the board. And they're limited. So you may end up, if someone else is sort of rushing through and claiming all of those, you may end up in a bit of a pickle.
Yeah,
like,
then you've got to wait till you can get to them on the river, which is a bit slower.
Yeah, way slower. Yeah, so I found that interesting, and yeah, it added some good tension. Moving along with the board, this whole levers system again was quite an interesting little
really
addition.
liked that.
Yeah,
I thought again that was a really clever idea, because you have to pay to put the lever in, and then that it's really cute the way that it's kind of like, okay, I've pulled that lever, I've used that bonus, now it's done, and I have to wait until the levers pop back up again.
Yeah,
I really liked that, and it added this strategic element of when to use those bonuses.
Absolutely.
The other thing I didn't mention is that if you don't use the levers, you get a bonus victory point at the end, at that interim scoring, which means there's that tension of, do I actually use it? Is it going to be hugely beneficial to me, or do I leave it and take the victory point?
Yeah, sometimes this is something that you realize as you're playing the game. Some of those levers are going to be essential. So it's not something that is like, oh, it's a nice to have. Yes, the more of them you have, the more points you're going to get at the end. But to accomplish a couple of different things, you're going to get stuck if you don't plan some very strategic ones, ideally kind of earlier on in the game as well.
Now, my favorite part of this whole game, I haven't even spoken about yet. It's a little bit complex, but essentially at the start of the game, every player is going to get 2 of these scoring tiles, and they're going to choose one to place in their part of the board, because as you can see, each of the player colors are represented here. So if I was to choose this one, and Maggie was to choose this one, and this one, you're yellow, and then in a 4-player game, we would, in a 2-player game, we'd add 2 kind of dummy ones here to represent the other players. This dictates 2 different scoring conditions for the game. The top half of these tiles have essentially what is a really powerful card ability. So if you can pay the cost that's there, you're going to be able to get this huge bonus, and you can do this once in the game for each of these tiles. If you do it for the tile that you committed to, then you're going to get twice the victory points for doing so. So it's important to keep that in mind, because it is a lot of victory points along the way. But my favorite part is the bottom half of these tiles, something that I really enjoyed and want to see more in Eurogaming, actually. I just think this is a fantastic idea, that at the bottom we have 4 other objectives that relate to things that you're going to get done in the game. For example, the number of levers that you've built on your player board, the progress that you've made on the income tracks, the number of settlements you've built here, and the number of 2 particular suits of cards that you've played into your tableau. And at the beginning of the game, you're looking at these 4 objectives, and you need to be able to commit to one of these objectives at the end of each interim scoring. If you meet the round objective for that scoring condition, so for example, building levers, you only need to have 1 in the first round, but if you skip this scoring objective until the 3rd round, then you need to have 5. So they are all escalating, and you've got to work out the order in which you're going to do those. Otherwise, you're going to lose victory points. And for me, that gave so much structure to the game, because I was thinking about, well, if I build levers, I know that I can get to 3 in round 2, but then settlements, I'm going to have to wait till the end of the game because I'm not focused on that right now.
I enjoyed the combination of the freedom of you can meet each one or decide to score each one at any of the 4 the interim rounds, but you will have to do all of them. So at some point you can't just go, well, I'll ignore that one. Not an option. The other interesting thing is the longer you leave it, the bigger the penalty, because what happens is if you're for example being forced to score one of those tiles, and say it's round 3 or round 4, that becomes sort of the penalty. So instead of getting positive victory points, it usually becomes the penalty, and it's sort of obviously, as it goes up, it's a higher penalty. So I enjoyed that you have the flexibility of how am I going to move these around, like at what point am I going to do them, but also the limitation of you will have to do them. I kind of feel like these are almost like I'm going to do a thematic stretch here, because there's not a lot that I could do from a thematic linking.
With,
it didn't feel very thematically immersive. But from a thematic stretch, I kind of feel like these are the expectations of the town. That it's like, well, these are all the things that you should get done, but by the depending on how long we've been here is how far advanced you should be on all those different areas. I don't know. That's my weird little ridge.
It adds a lot of variability to the game because
yeah.
Obviously those are changing for every game, and each player has the ability to contribute to what those scoring conditions are going to be, which is really interesting. Yeah. And we've used the word interesting so many times in describing this game. Yeah. There are so many mechanics in here that are both novel, they are also just incredibly smart. However, the way they come together, I would not necessarily say that this, for me, was a fun game.
Well, that's the other thing, is the length of play. So I believe on the box it says it's meant to be 40 minutes per player. We kind of found that it was longer than that. So it ended up almost stretching out to an hour per player. Yes, it gets faster as, you know, the more you know the game, and you know, and also obviously the fewer players that you have. But still, because even though there's all these interesting things going on, when you've been at it for so long, you start feeling like you're kind of rinse and repeating. And yes, even though you look at that board of actions and you go, there's so many to pick from, and you're getting, you know, to do another action on someone else's turn. But again, it starts to feel repetitive, and towards the later parts of the game, some of those actions are useless. So for example, once all the tiles have been played out, then there are no more spots to put tiles in. Then that action is, you know, it's a bit of a waste. So it ends up getting used less and less.
Yeah, I feel like the river itself is not interesting enough to be the core part of the game. What happens is I'm moving along the river after about 90 minutes to 2 hours on a 3-player game. We're halfway through the game, and you just get this sense of like, how have we only made it through half of the river? And because the river curves around and your boats end up back at the beginning again, and sure, it's quite quick to go around the second time. Yeah, it feels like it's Groundhog Day, and you do feel like you've come back up and you're like, oh my goodness, how are we only here? And what adds to that feeling is for me, there's not, surprisingly, for a game that has the flow of a river through it, the flow of the game is clunky. Yeah. It's a little bit clunky because of the handing this around, because of the fact that everyone is taking actions at the same time, and those actions change and have to be communicated to the whole table. Because there's so much going on, and a bit of AP with the cards and the actions. And it just feels like a bit of a slog. Yeah. And I wish it wasn't, because I feel like if maybe if it had pared back a couple of the ideas, or, you know, kind of funneled them into 2 different games, then some of these ideas I really, really love. I love the resource management, the levers, everything on its own is so great that it is hard to describe why this game doesn't have that same feeling like Great Western Trail, or even the mechanics in Maracaibo. You know, there is a smooth gameplay there. It feels like you're making progress. This game feels less like you're making progress.
But also in Maracaibo, for example, you can have one player kind of dictating the speed of the game, and things can go by really, really quickly. Even here, even when you've got people kind of going 4 steps at a time, it still felt like it took forever. And I think you're right. I think it's partly because you're passing the board around and people are deciding.
But in Maracaibo, when one player is racing, it actually impacts everybody else. Whereas here, it doesn't. It triggers scoring, but you still making your
around down the river,
sailing down the river, doing your thing, and you're not really that impacted.
Merrily.
And so I do feel like that if you're a person who likes a point salad Euro and you like to work through the efficiencies of this, that will keep you interested for sure. This is a game where, especially when we first started playing it, I felt like the newness of this board in particular was interesting, and I liked working out how to clear off this board more effectively, how that works in with the cards in your hand. But every time that I've played this, I just wish that it didn't overstay its welcome so much.
Yeah, it does, and that's exactly what it feels like. I feel like for me there's 2 things. One, you're right, it doesn't flow. It feels like you kind of start stopping. And the second thing is, not only does it not flow, it definitely feels like it just goes on far too long for the kind of things that you're doing. It feels like it could definitely end a lot quicker, and then I wouldn't start to get bored that I'm doing like the same thing over and over again.
Yeah, it doesn't feel particularly focused on an objective. In Great Western Trail, for example, another great rondel game where you are moving through, it feels like you are setting your own speed for a reason, and you're going through, and the great thing about that game is that you're constantly looking at your cows in your hand and evaluating what's going to happen when you get to the end, and that gives you this sense of momentum, and the time flies by, because I couldn't even tell you how long that takes to play per player, because I'm so focused on what's going on. And this just felt, with the start stopping, with the handing around of the actions, with not being able to fully plan what you're going to do until you get that that action selection board. It fell a little flat.
I feel like also, in a lot of these games, and in this one, you are building, I don't want to say a full engine, but a bit of an engine. Some of your cards that you're playing onto your tableau are going to give you additional boosts or powers. As you're getting more levers and more resources, it means that you can do more things. But because of the length of the game, it never really feels like, like with Great Western Trail, when you've got those really powerful cows and you're like, I can't wait to be able to play these. This never felt like it evolved like that to the point where you're like, now I feel really powerful and I can get a lot. I kind of started to feel like I was still a little bit shackled, because it was like, but there's still only so many things that I can do, or there's only so many places I can go on the board, and I didn't feel that sense of progression in a satisfying kind of way.
Yeah, there's no like big game breaking moves, or like those moments where you feel so happy with a particular combo. There's a couple of places that do that, or you might get to play multiple cards and you feel really good about that. But for the most part, all of the bonuses feel a bit samey. Yeah. And so that's, I think, just adds to that feeling of just not making any progress. So unfortunately, this is a game that probably won't stay in our collection, just because for the trade-off of game length versus the satisfaction of the gameplay is not there for us. But you may enjoy, if you don't mind that it's a bit of a longer game and you're mechanically driven. I would say that if you feel like you are a themer, this maybe isn't a game for you. It doesn't really feel that immersive. It does feel like kind of a bucket of Fista's ideas.
It feels like a museum. It's like you're walking through a museum of different, like, that piece is interesting and that piece is great. So like this bit of mechanic is interesting, that bit is really exciting. Oh, that's quite clever. But then it doesn't necessarily all come together. It's like they're all from it's like they came from different places almost. Let's also briefly touch on player count. So this plays 1 through to 4 players. We've played it at every player count.
Every player count. And for me, from a multiplayer, I'll let you talk about the solo, but the multiplayer experience, this is the trade-off. The more players you have, the longer the game takes, the more people you're passing around the action selection system through to. But at the same time, the more players you have, this puzzle becomes much more interesting, because there are more players vying for control of different areas, and you get to leapfrog more through the river. So I don't want this game to be any longer than it already is, but I really like the puzzle more with more players. And so it's kind of, that's where I'm feeling like the tension of what is the occasion for this game. Yeah,
it definitely felt more tense at the higher player count. At a 2-player count, I felt like I got less bored at a 2-player count, just because it's like I got to do my main action sooner. Whereas at the higher player counts, it's like, you're kind of passing it around. And yes, you are getting to do another, like the backup action or the auxiliary action. But it's like, they're kind of boring. And so
you can't plan for them. So you don't know what your bonus action is going to be. So sometimes it is useful to you, and sometimes it's not.
Yeah. And so I thought I would still prefer it at a 2-player count if we were to play this, just because I feel like I'll get to play sooner, but the tension definitely higher here in particular, and things just filled up a lot quicker when you're at that higher player count. I'll talk about the solo experience. So the solo does use an AI, so you've got these tiles that signal, or obviously like any AI are trying to mimic what it would be like for another player to be kind of getting in the way, triggering those interim scores, helping flesh out or put in more of those tiles on the board and those settlements, scoring different things. So it was one of those games that even at a solo count, I actually felt like I would get so bored halfway through. Also in general, because I don't enjoy facilitating an AI, even when they're fairly simple. And this one did have like a couple of steps and a couple of like referring back to, what does it do again when this is the condition? So that's enough to take me out of my own flow of the game. So in general, I'm not really a big fan of AI for that reason. But in this game, because on top of that, it still felt like it's taking me forever to get down this river. I really, really struggled to, sometimes I would even quit halfway through, which I don't feel very proud of, but it's truth of what happened. So this is not something that I would be playing solo, but again, if you do enjoy those mechanics and you have no issues with AI, then it might be worthwhile trying it out. Yeah.
So that is our review of Boonlake. If this review was at all helpful to you, please subscribe to the channel and hit like, and we will be back with more chats about crowdfunded campaigns as well as other board games. But otherwise, thanks for watching and bye for now.
Bye.